Yeah, we'll hear from Claudia Emerson on community and stakeholder engagement issues.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to point out, I've noticed a few people standing at the back for a long time, just to let you know that there is empty seats at the front in case you're getting tired. Okay. So I'm tasked this morning with presenting on the working group's recommendations for community and stakeholder engagement. And my sense is that if there's ever an audience of people who appreciate the value and importance of community stakeholder engagement, it's probably the folks in this room and indeed at this entire meeting, because I think we all know how valuable it is for global health research, for any research, in fact, that involves human subjects. And in large measure is because we are dependent on communities when we go in and the work that we do, that there's an important relationship that's built, a trust relationship that's built in working together with communities. And a lot has been said and written about community engagement in different contexts, in social science, in medicine, in health, and a lot of good work around what works, what doesn't work, lessons learned, best practices. And I think we can say at least two things about community engagement and stakeholder engagement, that it has both an intrinsic value and it has also a practical and instrumental value. So from the very practical side, community engagement is essential for working together with the communities and understanding what their values and concerns are, and ultimately to reduce the risk that a particular technology or intervention is going to be disruptive, or that the research is not going to have any value to them. And of course, there's always reputational risk for the researchers, for the sponsors, for those who are involved, all of the actors who are involved in any kind of research enterprise. It's important to understand what that is. And so community engagement is at least one way to understand what those risks are and how we can work together to overcome them. But more importantly, I think community engagement has this really intrinsic value. So this fundamentally about relationships with people working together to solve a complex problem, and trust is critical. So community engagement is essential for building trust. And what's going to be important, obviously, is going to be culturally appropriate engagement, which is reciprocal. So this is just not about going into a place and understanding needs, but it's a learning and sharing in good community engagement endeavors. The community is involved in shaping the research, the questions, the outcomes, and this is critically important for a good engagement process. So in terms of the recommendations that came out of this report, there are two things I think that are important in terms of the language and the terminology and how we think about community engagement. So one of the first questions is going to be who engages with whom. And an interesting shift happened from the WHO guidance framework of 2014 on testing of genetically modified mosquitoes, where the language of community engagement was related to the project team, the host community, and third parties. And then you fast forward till 2016 and the National Academy's report on gene drives, and the notion of community engagement is talked about in terms of communities, stakeholders, and public. So there's a little bit of a shift in terminology, and this is actually important because it says something about how narrow or how broad we're going to define a community, and also the implications for understanding interests and which interests ought to be prioritized in any kind of project. And so the community is defined in the National Academy's report as a group of people who live near or potential field trial or release site and that have immediate interests in the project itself. And this is a little bit different from how people understand communities in other sort of guidance documents. So for example, the Council, the International Council of Medicine, SIOMS, describes community as not just being those who are immediately impacted by research, but could be much broader. So it could be, for example, all of us sitting here, the global community. So I think the important message here is that people have very different understandings and concepts of what a community is. But for the context of a gene drive project where there's going to be a broad, so this is going to be a global, stakeholders are going to have, global stakeholders are going to have an interest in this. One of the key things to remember is that the community, the one that's going to be involved in, say, those initial first releases and tests actually have very critical interests. And so there was a desire to kind of narrow down that definition. So then a stakeholder is going to be a person with a professional or personal interest sufficient to justify engagement and may not have a geographic proximity to the release site. And so one thing we can say is that stakeholders are obviously going to include communities, and it's going to include those much broadly. So basically anyone with a stake or an interest in this kind of project, and that includes all of us here, is going to be a stakeholder. And then of course publics, this was important to designate publics, a shift from third parties to sort of different publics, because you're going to be, according to the National Academy reports, different publics, and those are those who have lack an immediate connection to the project, but nevertheless have concerns, hopes, fears, and values that contribute to decision making. And this is both folks that support projects and those who are have concerns and are opposed to them. And so a key thing to know is that the composition of these groups is going to change as the project evolves. There is going to be different obligations to each of these groups and in terms of what that engagement is going to be like. So the depth and breadth of engagement is going to change depending on who you are engaging with and what the goals are. But a key thing that's going to be common for all of them is that the interaction is going to be ongoing and iterative. So it's going to start at the beginning of the project and it's going to go all the way through. So I mentioned at the start that engagement has both intrinsic and sort of an extrinsic instrumental value and also an intrinsic value, but two other things that we can say about community engagement. One, that it's a science, and so it's a science in and of itself like any other science. And it's going to require a lot of sort of focused research and expertise in order to do this right. And so one of the things that the group was very focused about stating in the recommendations was that engagement should be context specific, culturally sensitive, and from what we've learned about best practices and research in the field is that it's best undertaken by locally known and respected persons. We also know that it's going to be an ongoing process, and one of the key things, and you all saw sort of the pathway that Stephanie laid out at the beginning, the engagement is going to start at the beginning and follow all the way through, including to post-surveillance activities. It should involve experts who are familiar in both the methodology and the practice, such as social scientists, ethicists, and others who can be involved in the development of a plan at the start and in its implementation. Another key piece, so because it's a science, we ought to monitor and evaluate, and one of the recommendations the group made is that be able to capture sort of those lessons, what works, what doesn't work. Is there anything unique about engaging in this area when you're releasing a sort of first-in-class novel technology where the potential risks and benefits need to be ascertained? And sort of an important message, and I think colleagues who work in this space are particularly, love to emphasize the idea that community engagement should not be confused with public relations, communications, or advocacy, though those things can be tools to engage. So the other point is that community engagement is an ethical obligation. So it is both a science and an ethical obligation. And this is pretty clear, and everyone here works in the field of public health or global health, and we know that it's important to engage with those who are going to be impacted and affected by the research that we undertake. And indeed, it's one of the requirements also in a lot of international guidance for human subjects. And so the ethical obligation here is about fundamentally about respecting persons and communities in their way of life, and that the research does not disrupt it in a way that leaves them worse off, right? So it's important to understand the needs and values and concerns, including for trial and post-trial activities. And so the post-trial activity actually is quite important because you don't want to go in and exit. You leave a footprint, and so it's important to know what those expectations are once you exit a community. Demonstration of respect is going to be dependent on the breadth and depth of the engagement. As I mentioned, it's an iterative process. So depending on which of those groups you're engaging with, the community is obviously going to involve a deeper level of engagement than, say, with the public, where you may just be sharing knowledge or information about the kind of research that's going on. you want to ensure that the value, that there is both ethical and social value, and these are important ethical requirements in all research involving human subjects. And I believe Steve talked about transparency throughout the process. And so this is important to think about. So with other researchers, with regulators, this is probably a mechanism that's going to happen through data sharing. But trying to be transparent with, say, publics, it's important to think about what kind of mechanisms you're going to use in order to be transparent with those who have interests and want to know about the research. We know also that as an ethical obligation that once fulfilled, community engagement actually improves the quality of research. So it improves the experience. A lot of research studies have shown that it improves the experience of research participants and of researchers and those that are directly involved with it, with the research itself. But it's also helpful in coordinating other studies and things that are going on. So this is a space where maybe there's a handful of people working on this type of work. You want to be able to share lessons learned. Maybe a particular community and adjoining communities will be jointly impacted. So this is one way through engagement that you can coordinate what's going on. And then, of course, both Steve and Willie talked about the importance of engaging with relevant oversight bodies, and that level of engagement is going to be different, but should also start at the beginning. So with your local, national, institutional, regional bodies, so biosafety committees, ethics committees, with ethics committees particularly important, since this is going to be the first time that we try anything like this. It's going to be the first time that they see a research project like this. So it's important to be engaging with them early and in leading up to this, to be building capacity about what sorts of things are we looking for when we're reviewing these types of research protocols. And so in thinking about how we engage with these different groups, there's an overlap really in terms of the development pathway, so from beginning to the end. There's engagement at the level of exchange of knowledge and data sharing, and also with communication and outreach activities. And so in supporting the development pathway, one of the first recommendations that the group made was around engaging an independent ethics advisory committee of external experts to support the project right from the beginning. So this is getting folks who are separate and apart outside of the research group, independent experts who can guide, sort of raise and understand what might be some of the ethical issues, both enablers and barriers to the project, and think about how these start right from the beginning, from the time you have the idea all the way through to your post-implementation surveillance. And actually, some of the groups that are involved in this research do have these kinds of independent ethics advisory committees supporting their work. The other recommendation is that the engagement activities need to be tailored to each phase of the product development pathway. And so we've already heard that engagement should be early, it should be sustained, but part of that tailoring is understanding what's needed at the beginning. And so in our group, there were discussions around whether, for example, at the level of the lab, or even in the sort of the cage studies, once you go into community, whether we could invite community members to come and tour the facilities and see what's going on, how the mosquitoes are being reared in the insectary, what kinds of things are going on, give them an opportunity to sort of view what's happening, understand questions. And so that would be sort of a very tailored and specific activity that we would do right at the beginning. And you could imagine all sorts of things that you might do all along the pathway that are specific to this to address any kinds of concerns that people are expressing, questions that they want answered. And so this kind of tailoring is going to be critical, particularly to this. And it's something that we don't often do in sort of your standard sort of vaccine or drug kind of testing where you have engagement processes, but we don't necessarily invite people in and say, do you want to tour my vaccine lab, right, and see what's going on. The other important part of engagement, and this will be at all levels, is for sharing knowledge and data that comes out of the project. And so one of the key recommendations was to keep open and accessible records of any accidental or intended releases, make all risk assessments publicly available so people know what's going on, share field data with malaria research and control communities. So this is at the level of the stakeholders that are in the researcher groups, consortia, and then make baseline data and modeling results available. Obviously, this is a first in class. It's the first time we're doing this. We want to make sure that everybody's learning from each other. but also part of sort of keeping those risk assessments public and the kinds of information that we share. Determining what kind of information, maybe broader publics, so just folks who read the newspaper. I mean, we've all seen some of the sort of the media published around gene drive. Some of it can be quite positive and probably too far off around, this is the panacea, this is what's going to solve, vector control or vector disease issues, and then we see the sort of the other side of it and concerns around Franken-Mozzies and other kinds of sort of very hyped up negative media around gene drive mosquitoes. So I think it's important to have sort of public facing information shared for the consumption in that group. And that's the part around communication and outreach. And so part of that is to consult also, so engagement with local authorities on the development of plans for that broader public, create materials that are appropriate for engagement, that explain clear language, what the audience needs to know about this type of science, including for those who disagree. So folks who are very opposed to GM obviously are going to express very strong views. It's also important to engage with them. We recommended consulting with sociologists and linguists to develop the necessary vocabulary. So some of this terminology is not exactly translatable in all languages, and it could be very difficult to explain to people what a gene drive is. And translating, obviously, materials into local language and idioms will be critical. So we want to ensure consistency in communication and reaching out to the different stakeholder groups. And the group discussed the importance of having somebody who has experience in science communication, or somebody who can undertake this training and be able to sort of deal with some of the questions that arise. The question of whether obviously a scientist, and I saw it within the program, there's been a lot of great sort of side meetings here around communicating with the media and how do you communicate the science. Scientists do have a responsibility to communicate their work with the broader public, and so a key piece of this is engaging with the media, who, as I've already mentioned, can sometimes present very skewed perspectives on something like a novel science like gene drive. And so it's important to have these plans that can engage with them in a very clear manner. And lastly, be ready with FAQs, anticipate confusing and controversial messages. Be ready that there's going to be folks who are going to be strongly opposed to this and will be very vocal about it, and we just want to be ready for that. So thank you very much.